Later that day. "Can I get anybody anything while I'm up?" Jessie asked, as she left the bonfire and headed towards the house. "Aye, lassie, I'd be grateful if you'd fetch me another cold long neck, if you don't mind," Jack Braggs said in his best pirate accent. "I'm fine. Me too," Sean and Abby said, sitting close to the fire on a makeshift bench. The sun hadn't set yet, but it was cooling off quickly in the late afternoon. "Okay, 2 cold long necks coming up," Jessie said, heading off the short distance to the house. "2, Abby said in her serious mother tone of voice, as she eyed her daughter in exaggerated suspicion. "That's right, Mama. 1 for Mr. Braggs and 1 for me," Jessie called back over her shoulder, without missing a stride. "Strong-willed little girl you got there," Sean observed, watching the concern on Abby's face as she watched Jessie's retreating form. Abby answered, still lost in thought while watching Jessie. "I'll bet she's a lot like you were at that age," Sean offered. "Yes," Abby said slowly after a moment. "I was just thinking the same thing, and it drives me crazy. She seems like a real good one, too. You ought to be proud," Sean said. "Oh, don't get me wrong, she is a good kid, and I don't know what I'd do without her. She's just growing up so quick, and I'm kind of having a hard time with it at the moment." Abby sighed. They sat in silence a moment. "I can't believe this house," Abby blurted out, trying to change the subject. "The outside looks fabulous. I can't believe what you all have accomplished in such a short time. Did you inventory the contents, too?" "No," Sean said, shaking his head. "We carried it all out and piled it in that big old circus tent Jack brought up from Norfolk with him." "Ain't no circus tent," Jack Braggs chimed in for the first time, sounding hurt. "It's military surplus. Ain't no circus in the military, except maybe the top brass at the Pentagon," Jack added, scratching his scruffy beard. Abby shook her head in wonder. "Sean, I can't believe you. You shouldn't be so casual with those things. You really have some nice pieces there, and in a tent, anyone could just waltz in here and carry it all off. Have you contacted my father yet about coming out here and taking a look?" Abby stood with her hands on her hips, and it looked like a teacher scolding a naughty child. "No," Sean answered, bowing his head to look at the ground, playing the part of a chastised child well. "Have you got someone else in mind? That's okay, but just lying around in a tent, you're begging to be ripped off. I don't mean to lecture you, Sean," Abby said, softening her tone and reaching out to squeeze his arm. "I'm sorry if I sound like I was. I just don't want to see you get ripped off." "No offense taken, and, thanks," Sean said shyly, reaching forward and kissing Abby's forehead. "It's just we've been so busy cleaning out the inside and getting the outside ship-shape. I hadn't hardly given it a second thought. No one's going anywhere with any of it, though." Abby looked at him speculatively. "No, really," Sean said, catching the disbelief in her look. "You forget I'm an official representative of Security International. Nobody could get inside that tent without Jack or I knowing about it, much less make a mess of anything. It's wired with heat sensors and motion detectors, all the latest in home security. I borrowed them from the office." He gave her an inspirational wink. "Field test, don't you know? We emptied the house, wired it all up, and pretty much forgot about it. We've been working night and day, getting the outside like you see it, and lining up a bricklayer to rebuild 2 of the chimneys. Old Jack's a whiz when it comes to wood, but we're both lost on the bricklaying." "Aye, you don't see too many bricklayers at sea," Jack added, defending Sean's position. "Don't get me wrong," Abby said, shaking her head quickly, afraid they'd misunderstand and take offense. "I know you've been busy, and I'm amazed you've gotten so far at all. If you want, Jessie and I can lend a hand and inventory what you have in the tent, so you at least got some idea of what's here," she said, smiling, hoping she could be of help. "What do I hear myself being volunteered for?" Jessie spoke up guardedly as she came back to the fire. She looked first at her mother, then at Sean. "I heard my name being mentioned." "Aye, lassie, I was wondering when you'd be bringing the long neck, if you don't mind," Jack Braggs said, reaching for the cold bottle of beer in her right hand. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Braggs," she chirped, extending the cold, sweaty bottle towards Jack. "I was telling Sean and Jack here that you and I could inventory the contents of the house. You know, the antiques. He's just got them piled up in the tent by the house," Abby said, sounding eager. Jessie eyed her mother suspiciously and whined. "But, Mama, it's Saturday. I have plans for Saturday evening. I'm not exactly unpopular, you know," Jessie said in a tone that sounded like she was too busy to be bothered, as she took a defiant sip of her own beer. "Jessie Elizabeth," Abby almost shouted aghast. "Oh, Mama, I'm just funning you." Jessie said, dismissing her mother with a wave of her hand. I think it would be fun, Mr. Murphy. Mama told me there were a lot of neat pieces in the house. You can call me Sean, Jessie, please. Mr. Murphy makes me sound too old coming from you, Sean said, smiling. But I can't ask you and Abby to... Nonsense, Abby interrupted. You said yourself you've got a lot to do. We'd be more than happy to, unless you don't trust us, Abby said defensively. Don't be silly, Sean said. I invited you out here to relax and see the place, not put you to work. It's okay, Sean. Really, it is. I don't mind, and I know Mama's dying to spend some time with you, Jessie blurted out, smiling mischievously. Jessie Elizabeth. Abby blushed. But Jessie continued, like she'd never heard her. We won't get in your way. We promise you and Mr. Braggs will never even know we're here. Jack, lassie. Jack. Jack intoned, draining his beer. I beg your pardon, Jessie asked, thinking she missed something somewhere. Jack. Call me Jack. Everyone around here's getting chummy, and everyone's still calling me Mr. Braggs. It's Jack, plain and simple. It won't do to have you two pretty lassies calling me Mr. Braggs if you're going to be helping me and Sean with this derelict house here. Good, then it's agreed. Abby stepped in firmly. Well, come on, Jessie. Let's get started while we still have some light left, Abby said eagerly. Not to worry, ma'am. We've got us some pretty fair work lights. The dark won't slow you down none, Jack informed them. Well, if we're to call you Jack, then let's drop the ma'am rubbish. It's Abby and Jessie, Abby said, shaking Jack's hand formally. Now can you disarm your own booby-trapped tent so we can get started, or do you need 007 over there? She laughed, giving Jack a big wink. I think I can manage that, Abby, Jack said as both women took him by the arms and led him towards the house, leaving Sean standing by the fire with a contented grin on his face. Okay, Jessie, what's next? Abby asked, looking up from her writing tablet. She saw Jessie across the tent kneeling. Jessie, what you got? It's just a small valise, Mama, but it's heavy. I'm trying to open it and see what's inside, Jessie answered, her voice strained by the concentration. Abby heard the latch pop, then a cracking sound. But all she could see was Jessie's back, the work light flickering around, and shadows jumping as Jessie moved the work light around to examine the valise's contents better. Mama, come look, Jessie said, looking over her shoulder and motioning her mother over to her. Abby shifted, then got to her feet and moved toward Jessie. What was the old lady's name you said lived here? Jessie asked, sitting back, holding something. Myra Connell, Abby answered as she got close enough to see Jessie holding a small book. How old was she when she died? Jessie asked, carefully opening the book. Around 100 or so. Why? Abby asked, a little confused. Wow, Jessie said, and was quiet. Abby moved close, looked over Jessie's shoulder into the valise, and saw it was full of old books. Mama, Jessie said in a fascinated whisper, it's her diaries. The valise is full of them. She must have kept one nearly all of her life. Look at these. Oh my, Abby said, awed. You know, Jess, she lived here from before the Civil War up until just before I was born. Can you imagine the history she lived through? The Civil War, Lincoln's death, Reconstruction, the Wright brothers, so many things. I'll bet these would be fascinating to read. Abby, Jessie, come here, they heard Sean's voice calling them from inside the house. Jessie carefully closed the book and set it down into the valise as both women looked questioningly at each other. Abby, Jessie, they heard him call again. Abby turned and moved quickly to the tent flap as Jessie got up and wasn't far behind. Abby stepped through the entrance and Jessie was looking over her shoulder. They saw Sean leaning out an upstairs window. Hey, we just found something interesting up here. How about grabbing a round of beers for us all and coming up here? I think it might get interesting. Abby and Jessie looked at each other. Abby turned back to tell Sean what they had just found, but he had disappeared. Well, I never, Abby huffed. Jessie chuckled. Mama, he's ordering us around already. If he's going to do that, tell him we want higher wages. Jessie poked her mother in the ribs. I've got a half a mind to just go back in the tent and read those diaries. That's a find, too, Abby said as she headed for the house. What about the tent, Mama? Jess chided as she followed her mother towards the house. Mama must really like him, she thought, smiling. He calls, she listens. She couldn't ever remember her mother doing that before. Sean and Jack had moved the tripod stand that held a bar of 4 quarts halogen work lights into the small bedroom that was pockmarked with bullet holes. When Abby and Jessie entered, each of them carrying 2 bottles of beer, they found Jack and Sean sitting on the flooring in the unnatural, brightly lit room. "So, what's the big deal?" Jesse asked, taking the words out of Abby's mouth as the women moved closer and peered in the hole over the men's shoulders. Sean accepted a beer from Abby and wiped some of the grime from his face with his sleeve as he began to explain. "We were pulling up some of the flooring up here to run wiring for the overhead lights on the first floor. You see, they never wired any electric into the house except the rear section of the kitchen. Anyway, we pulled up this loose board to run a wire, and look what we found." Sean moved out of the way to give the women a better view. Abby and Jess peered closer into the hole as Sean explained. There seems to be a note on a small book next to some sort of metal box. "What's in it?" Jesse asked as they peered into the hole. "I know, dear lassie, we were waiting for you two." Jack spoke up for the first time since Abby and Jesse had joined them. "That piece of paper is probably as fragile as a butterfly wing," Abby said absently, her mind trying to race to think of a way to extract it without destroying it. "What about a couple pieces of glass from one of the old window panes?" Sean said, as if reading Abby's thoughts. "That might work," Abby said thoughtfully, her mind still thinking of the best way to handle it. "Yes, Sean, I think that will work, if we slide one piece underneath and put the other one on top, trapping the paper between," Abby said, describing the movements needed with hand motions while she spoke. "I saw two pieces earlier that would work," Jesse said, turning and heading out the door. While they heard her descending the steps, Abby looked curiously at Sean and asked, "So, what do you think?" Sean shrugged. "I don't know, maybe some sort of strongbox? Money, jewels, family papers? Who knows?" They all stared at the box, each lost in their own thoughts about what the box might contain, each caught up in the excitement of the moment. Jack Braggs broke the silence. "If it's cash, it's probably Confederate script from the war and not worth a red cent," he commented, taking a big gulp from his beer. "Not at all," Abby corrected, looking down at the men. "Real Confederate money would be worth more now than it ever was, collectors and all." They heard Jesse on the steps, and they turned their heads anxiously as they watched her enter the room carefully, carrying two glass panes. "How about these?" she asked hopefully, holding them up for inspection. "Well, we won't know until we try," Sean said, putting down his beer and taking the larger of the two pieces from Jesse's grasp. "Looks like it'll just fit," Sean observed, holding the pane down to the space between the floor joists. Jack moved out of the way, and Abby took the other piece of glass and kneeled down next to Sean. He looked over at her and gave her a big wink. "Well, here goes nothing," he said. And they all held their breath as Sean moved ever so slowly, maneuvering the first corner, then the whole edge, and firmly sliding the whole piece under the paper. With that done, he sat back, and they all let out a collective sigh of relief. Abby leaned forward and slowly placed one edge lengthwise flush against the bottom of the hole and the first piece of glass, and slowly lowered it down until both pieces of glass were flat together with the paper trapped between. She then adjusted her hands until she held both pieces of glass and lifted it out of the hole carefully and handed it to Sean, who gently set it on the table next to the bed. They all gathered around and read Wilt Binford's note to Myra Connell. "How romantic," Jessie sighed, clasping her hands together as a single tear ran down her cheek. "What do you make of it, Sean?" Jack asked. "I don't know for sure," Sean answered. "From the sounds of it, someone involved in a fight here was sweet on the woman that lived here and left this note quickly. Maybe he realized all was lost. Who knows? What's that book down there?" Jessie looked down in the hole and recognized the book immediately. "It's her diary," Jessie blurted. "It's just like the ones we found in the tent." Abby looked down in the hole and nodded in agreement. "Yes, we found a whole valise full of them in the tent. We were just getting to them when you called us up here. She must have written her whole life down, day by day, from the looks of the valise." She finished and looked into Sean's eyes. "It must have been important," Sean guessed. He knew where she kept her diary hidden up here, and left it so no one else could find it, he said, looking at the other three as they nodded in agreement with his logic. "Maybe she never did find it," Abby added. "Remember the way this room was when I brought you here? As though it hadn't been touched, broken glass still on the floor as if it had just been closed up." She let her thought hang. "I don't see a package," Jessie observed. Sean shrugged and reached in to grab the box. His first movement didn't budge it. It was a lot heavier than it looked. "Jack, how about giving me a hand?" Sean requested, adjusting his position. Jack kneeled down eagerly, and together they lifted the heavy box from its long-time hiding place down in the floor. The tension grew, and they were all silent again as Sean flipped The reluctant latches of the strongbox and the tortured hinges screeched in protest as the lid slowly slid open. Inside was another note. This one was folded in a small package, wrapped in rotting oilcloth and tied closed with rotted leather thongs. "Looks like we need more glass, Jess," Sean stated, looking up to Jesse. "Gotcha," Jesse said, and scampered out of the room again. "Who's this Colonel Mosby this soldier talks of in the first letter, Abby? The one the package was meant for?" Sean asked, seeming genuinely curious. Abby thought a moment, then recited the learned local history from long ago. Colonel John Singleton Mosby, commander of the 43rd Virginia Cavalry, guerrillas, better known as Mosby's Rangers. They operated in this area the last 2 years or so behind federal lines, raiding supplies and attacking trains and wagons, she shrugged. There's a lot of books and stories about them, but as history goes, they're pretty obscure. They heard Jessie tromping up the steps, and she burst into the room a moment later. "Here you go," she said, displaying 2 more panes of glass. "Thank you," Sean said, taking one. He tried slipping it under the paper, but it was hopelessly too big. "It's no use. We need something smaller and more flexible to fit inside there," Sean said, giving up. "What about another piece of paper? You could slide it underneath, lift it out, then put it on the glass and slip it out," Abby offered. "I'll get it," Jesse offered, and was off in a flash. "Can you get to the package without disturbing that there paper?" Jack Braggs asked, bending closer. "I don't think so," Sean offered, looking at it from a different angle. They heard Jessie on the steps, and a moment later she appeared. "Here, try this," she said, extending a roll of aluminum foil. "I thought it would support better," Jessie said, shrugging. "Good girl," Sean praised as he tore off a large piece of the foil. All eyes were riveted to him carefully as he slid the foil under the paper and slowly lifted it, then laid it on the glass pane and snapped the foil, as if he were a magician pulling a tablecloth from under a fully set table. Then he placed the other pane over top and laid it on the bed beside the first one. Abby reached into the box carefully and picked up the diary and handed it to Jessie, who placed it on the bed, along with the paper and the glass panes. "Oh, would you look at these?" Abby said, holding up a string of pearls. "Oh, Mama, they're beautiful," Jessie beamed, clapping her hands together excitedly. "What else is there?" Sean asked curiously, looking over Abby's shoulder. "Not much besides the package, a few more pieces of jewelry. Oh, and a couple of old pictures," Abby answered slowly, concentrating on the contents. "That just leaves the package," Jack Braggs said as they all turned their eyes down into the strongbox. "Well, we'll never find out what's in it by just staring at it, now will we?" Sean asked rhetorically as he produced a Swiss Army knife and flipped one of the blades. Sean reached down and worked the knife under the rotted leather thong tying the package closed, causing it to fall away. He put the knife down and tried to lift the package out. "Boy, this is heavy," he said when it didn't move easily. Then, using both hands, he lifted it from the strongbox and set it on the floor next to the hole with a heavy thunk. The thunk echoed through the floor, and as it did so, so did all of the sound in the room. Sean reached toward the rotting oilskin, almost hesitantly, almost as if he feared what he might or might not find. You could hear a pin drop as all eyes stared at the package with curiosity, and all breath was caught in their throats.